It all started when Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood, decided she'd had enough of the chaos around her. For years, she'd been the HOA president, reigning over her tiny little kingdom with an iron fist. Everyone dreaded her. Kids didn't dare ride their bikes past her house, and adults walked the other way when they saw her approaching. But that was just how Karen liked it. After all, she had nothing better to do than make everyone else's lives miserable. It was a warm Tuesday morning when Karen noticed something that sent her into a fit of rage. There was a new family in the neighborhood, young, friendly, and full of energy. But what really got under Karen's skin was their dog, a big, playful golden retriever named Max. The dog had the audacity to run around the front yard, wagging his tail, having the time of his life. It was a spectacle of joy that Karen couldn't stand. Ugh, dogs like that should be banned, Karen muttered under her breath, glaring out her window. She quickly concocted a plan. She couldn't just ban the dog outright, but she could certainly make life miserable for the new family. They'd get hit with noise complaints, unkempt lawn fines, and, of course, the dreaded violation notices. The dog would be the perfect excuse to turn their perfect little world upside down. She went straight to her computer and began typing up a complaint letter to the HOA board, ensuring it was as dramatic as possible. Max barks constantly, disrupting the peace, she wrote, adding several exclamation marks for extra flair. This dog is an offense to every neighbor's peace of mind. She hit send and smiled wickedly, imagining the new family's confusion and frustration as they received their first of many violation notices. But, as with all things Karen, her plan would backfire spectacularly. The next day, Karen arrived at her usual HOA meeting, ready to ruffle some feathers and reinforce her control over the neighborhood. She walked in with her head held high, expecting to get unanimous support for her crusade against the new family's dog. What she didn't expect was the sudden, unexpected arrival of an unfamiliar face, the new neighbor, Ben. Ben, a tall, confident man with a quick smile, strolled into the room like he owned the place. Karen was immediately put off by the presence of someone so relaxed, someone who clearly didn't know the unwritten rules of the HOA. Ben sat down casually, his eyes scanning the room as Karen began to present her complaint. When she finished, he raised an eyebrow. "Isn't it a little petty to go after a dog for barking?" he asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I mean, it's a dog. It's kind of what they do, right?" Karen's face turned red with rage. How dare he challenge her authority so openly? The other board members, usually too scared to speak up, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Ben continued, unaffected. "Maybe you should focus on more important things, like the fact that half the neighborhood is sinking into disrepair because of your amazing leadership." He flashed a smirk, completely throwing Karen off her game. The HOA meeting was never quite the same after that. Karen, flustered and defeated, found herself slowly losing grip on the power she had held so tightly for years. But the worst part? Ben was just getting started. Karen's blood was boiling as she watched Ben, the new neighbor, stroll out of the HOA meeting like a rock star who'd just mic dropped his way into the spotlight. Who did he think he was? And why was everyone so damn charmed by him? It was supposed to be her world, her little slice of suburban paradise, where everything fell under her strict rules and regulations. But now Ben had come in, shattering her reign with his ridiculous charisma and that stupid grin on his face. That night, Karen didn't sleep a wink. Her mind raced with all the ways she could assert her power. She couldn't let him get away with humiliating her in front of the whole board. So she did what any self-respecting HOA tyrant would do. She devised a plan to make his life miserable. The golden retriever was just the beginning. She was going to tear Ben down piece by piece. The next day, Karen was on a mission. Armed with her trusty clipboard and a camera, she set out to take pictures of every minor flaw in Ben's house and yard. "Oh, you think you can just waltz in here and challenge my authority?" she muttered as she snapped photos of slightly untrimmed hedges and a cracked walkway. She sent them all to the HOA board with a note that read, "Unbelievable neglect on the part of the new resident. This property is a disgrace to the neighborhood." Ben, however, wasn't worried in the slightest. He'd been expecting something like this. What Karen didn't know was that Ben had been tracking her every move since the first HOA meeting. He had a whole dossier of her most ridiculous moments, including an infamous incident where she tried to fine a neighbor for having a non-compliant bird bath. The best part? He'd gotten the whole thing on camera, and he was about to unleash it at the most inconvenient moment for her. Ben, with his signature calm demeanor, arrived at the next HOA meeting with his own little surprise. Karen could already feel her palms sweating when she saw him walk in, the devilish grin still plastered on his face. But this time, he wasn't sitting quietly, waiting for his turn to speak. No, he was setting up his laptop, a sly look in his eyes. The board members watched curiously as Ben clicked a few buttons, and the room was suddenly filled with the sound of Karen's voice. The footage was from months ago, showing Karen lecturing a poor elderly woman for improper mailbox placement before demanding a fine of $500. The video went on to show her attempting to impose a ridiculous rule banning all patio furniture that didn't match the house's trim color, while threatening a neighborhood with legal action for things like unsanctioned lawn gnomes. The more the video played, the more Karen's face drained of color. The room was filled with uncomfortable giggles, and Karen's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Oh, Karen," Ben's voice rang out sweetly, "I don't think you can be the neighborhood's moral compass if you're breaking your own rules. Seems like you've been, what's the word, abusing your position." He paused dramatically. "Don't worry, Karen. I'm sure the HOA board would love to hear about your past actions." The board members exchanged nervous glances, and for the first time ever, Karen was the one who felt cornered. Ben had done it. He'd turned the tables on her. Karen could only sputter, struggling to find a comeback. "Is this how we do things in this neighborhood now?" she huffed, trying to save face. This is a violation of privacy." "Don't worry, Karen," Ben said, his smile widening. "You're still in charge, for now." Karen's mind was racing, and her grip on her clipboard tightened until her knuckles turned white. This wasn't over. She would make Ben pay. The following days felt like an eternity for Karen. Every time she saw someone in the neighborhood, they either looked away or chuckled behind her back. The video of her leadership had become a viral sensation in the community, and Karen's reputation was circling the drain faster than she could comprehend. But true to her Karen nature, she wasn't one to accept defeat easily. Oh no, this was just the beginning of her revenge. She'd make Ben regret ever crossing her. With a new fire in her eyes, Karen doubled down. She began sending out violation notices to every single house in the neighborhood for the most ridiculous reasons she could think of. Your garden gnome is half an inch too tall, the shade of your mailbox is slightly off-white, and, her personal favorite, your garage door is 2 degrees above the neighborhood's standard. She had no shame. This was war, and if Ben thought he could take her down, she'd drag everyone down with her. But Ben, ever the calm strategist, wasn't fazed. He saw Karen's petty retaliation for what it was, desperation. He knew she would try to escalate things, but he was ready. The next HOA meeting was approaching, and Ben was already making plans to drop another bombshell that would utterly ruin her. What Karen didn't know was that Ben had quietly rallied support from some of the more reasonable neighbors, those who were tired of Karen's tyrannical ways, but had been too afraid to speak up. They were fed up with the fines, the rules that made no sense, and the overall hostile atmosphere Karen had created in the neighborhood. They knew this was their chance to take back control, and Ben was their hero. Together, they formed a plan to finally put Karen in her place once and for all. The night before the HOA meeting, Karen sat at her dining room table, smugly preparing yet another set of notices. She was confident that she'd come out on top, but little did she know the meeting was going to be a game changer. The morning of the meeting, Karen arrived at the HOA office early, as usual, ready to play the role of the righteous leader. She was preparing her speech about order and decency when Ben walked in with a few familiar faces in tow. He wasn't alone this time. He had gathered a group of the most vocal and fed-up neighbors, all of whom were now prepared to take action. They had a plan, and it involved Karen's downfall. As soon as the meeting started, Karen launched into her usual diatribe, accusing everyone of violating her precious rules. But before she could finish, Ben stood up, his voice smooth and calm. "Before we start, I think it's time for a little transparency, Karen," he said, clicking a button on his laptop. Suddenly, the projector screen flickered to life, revealing footage of Karen not just abusing her position, but actively accepting bribes from contractors to turn a blind eye to code violations. The room fell silent. The neighbors gasped, their jaws collectively dropping as they watched Karen's crooked dealings unfold on the screen. Her once ironclad position was now in complete jeopardy. "What is this?" Karen hissed, standing up so quickly that her chair fell backward. "This is illegal." "No, Karen," Ben replied coolly. "What's illegal is what you've been doing. All we've done is expose the truth." Karen, now cornered, tried to deflect. "This is all lies. It's slander." But the board members weren't having it. The damage had been done. Karen's web of lies, fines, and shady deals had been laid bare for all to see. The tide had turned, and it was clear that her time as HOA president was up. Karen's face was a mix of disbelief and fury, but deep down, she knew. Her reign was over. Karen's world had flipped on its head, and she was still trying to catch her breath. The realization that she had been exposed, that her grip on the HOA was slipping through her fingers, sent her into a tailspin. The faces of the neighbors at the meeting blurred into a sea of mockery, their eyes no longer filled with fear. Instead, they were filled with something far worse: disappointment. They had seen her for what she truly was, and now they had a decision to make. The only thing they were sure of, it was time for her to go. Karen stormed out of the meeting, her mind racing. Her first instinct was to confront Ben, to tear him down and call him every name in the book. But she couldn't. No, she needed a plan. She needed something bigger, something that would make him regret exposing her. She could feel the weight of her powerlessness, and it sent her into a frenzy. Back at home, she paced the floor, her brain buzzing with 1,000 thoughts. She couldn't let Ben win, not like this. Karen was smart. She had always been a few steps ahead of everyone, and she would find a way to turn this around. She needed a weapon, and that weapon had to be something Ben wasn't expecting. Something personal. That's when it hit her. Ben had exposed her for what she was, but he didn't know about the dirty little secret she'd been hiding for years. Something that could ruin him just as easily as she'd been ruined. A little favor she'd called in, a small, strategic lie. The next morning, Karen made a few phone calls. She contacted her lawyer, a slick, unscrupulous type who had done favors for her in the past. Together, they hatched a plan to file a lawsuit against Ben, accusing him of defamation and harassment. The lawsuit would be built on a foundation of lies, but Karen knew it didn't matter. The goal wasn't to win. It was to drag Ben through the mud, to make his life as miserable as hers had become. By the time the lawsuit papers were delivered to Ben's door, Karen felt a twisted sense of satisfaction. She could almost taste the victory. Ben would be tied up in legal battles, forced to spend time and money defending himself. She, on the other hand, would be free to reclaim her position as the HOA queen. The thought of it made her smile. But Ben wasn't about to play her game. No, he'd anticipated something like this. He knew Karen would go for the personal attack. What Karen didn't realize was that Ben had been gathering his own dirt on her. He'd spent the last few weeks talking to other neighbors, some who had been too scared to speak up before, and what he uncovered was damning. At the next HOA meeting, Ben showed up with a few surprises of his own. As soon as Karen walked in, thinking she was about to watch her lawsuit destroy him, Ben stood up, calm and collected. "Karen," he said, his voice smooth, "I think it's time for us to have a little real conversation about transparency." He clicked a button, and the projector screen flickered to life once again. This time, the footage wasn't just about Karen's misdeeds. It was about the connections she had with shady contractors, the kickbacks, the under-the-table deals, the ones Ben had been compiling for weeks. Every little secret she had worked so hard to hide was now on full display. And just for good measure, Ben had included a little surprise, an audio recording of Karen threatening one of her own neighbors to not speak out about her actions, or else she'd have their property foreclosed. Karen's face turned pale as the room erupted in murmurs. Her legal threats suddenly felt useless. She had underestimated Ben. The truth was louder than any lawyer's words. "You're done, Karen," Ben said, his voice unwavering. "This isn't a game anymore." Karen, now visibly shaking with rage, opened her mouth to shout, but no words came out. She was trapped. And for the first time in years, she realized she was completely powerless. The final nail in Karen's coffin had been driven. She was no longer the feared HOA tyrant, the woman who held the entire neighborhood in the palm of her hand. The once golden image she had carefully crafted had shattered, piece by piece, under the weight of Ben's relentless pursuit of the truth. But even now, Karen refused to admit defeat. No, that was the one thing she wasn't willing to do. She couldn't let Ben have the satisfaction of seeing her crumble, especially not in front of the entire neighborhood. But Karen was fighting a losing battle. The neighbors, once too afraid to speak up, now saw her for who she truly was. They no longer feared her. They were done with her. The HOA board, who had once tiptoed around her every word, now looked at her with a mixture of disgust and pity. She had lost her influence, her power, and now she was on the verge of losing everything. At the next HOA meeting, the board members voted unanimously to remove Karen from her position as president. They cited her unethical behavior and failure to uphold the integrity of the HOA as their reasons. But Karen couldn't hear them. She was too busy trying to hold on to whatever shred of control she thought she had left. As the vote was announced, Karen's face went pale. The last flicker of her power extinguished in an instant. The room was buzzing with whispers, but Karen was oblivious. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a disgrace," she snarled, her voice shaking with rage. "You can't just do this to me. I made this neighborhood." Ben, sitting near the front, couldn't help but smirk. The woman who had once thought she controlled everything, who had terrorized the people around her for years, was now standing there, desperate and humiliated. It was the perfect moment. "You didn't make this neighborhood, Karen," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "You just thought you did. The truth is, this neighborhood survived despite you. And now, well, it's finally free from your reign of terror." Karen's face contorted in fury, her hands trembling as she glared at Ben. But the board members didn't back down. One by one, they voiced their support for the vote to remove her. No one was on her side anymore. It was over. In a final act of defiance, Karen stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind her with such force that the entire building shook. But even in her rage, she knew deep down that the damage had been done. She had no power left. The neighbors didn't fear her anymore. The HOA was no longer her playground, and she had nothing to cling to but her own bitter anger. As she walked down the sidewalk, she noticed the neighbors gathered in small groups, talking and laughing, no longer looking over their shoulders when she walked by. They had their freedom back. And Ben, the man who had brought her to her knees, was at the center of it all, surrounded by people who now saw him as the true leader of the neighborhood. Karen turned her head away, unable to bear the sight of her world collapsing. Her worst nightmare had just become reality. The neighborhood she had once controlled was now free of her influence, and Ben had become the hero they never knew they needed. And as for Karen, she was left with nothing but the echoes of her own defeat, and with that, the reign of Karen was over. For good.